I am sitting at my kitchen table tonight. The same small oak table where I once packed school lunches, paid bills, folded laundry, and watched my children grow into adults. The overhead light humming softly like it always has, and I keep replaying a moment from earlier this week that I cannot shake. A moment that reminded me how quietly a woman can disappear while still breathing. Because when the doctor walked into that white, cold room, clipboard in hand, eyes scanning papers instead of faces, he looked straight past me and spoke to my son, not me, and in that instant, at 77 years old, I felt myself shrink, not physically, but spiritually, as if decades of living, loving, surviving had suddenly made me less visible than the man who happened to be standing beside my bed. And before anyone assumes this is a story about anger or blame, let me say this: it is a story about dignity, about memory, about what it feels like to be present but unheard, and how invisibility often arrives not with cruelty, but with politeness, with assumptions, with the quiet belief that age has replaced agency. My name is Margaret Elaine Whitaker. I was born in 1948 in a small town in Ohio. I grew up in a world where women were expected to be strong without complaint, polite without protest, and grateful without question. I married young, raised 3 children, buried a husband, worked when I had to, sacrificed when I must, and carried my responsibilities like second skin, never expecting applause, only respect. And for most of my life, I received it. In small ways, in everyday acknowledgement, in being looked at when spoken to, in being asked what I wanted. But somewhere along the way, as my hair turned white and my hands grew thinner, that respect began to fade into assumption, into decisions made for me rather than with me. And I didn't notice it all at once. It crept in slowly, like a dimmer switch being turned down without my permission. Doctors began addressing my children instead of me. Waiters asked my son what I would like to eat. Bankers explained things to my daughter while I sat quietly holding my purse. And each time I told myself it wasn't worth correcting, that people meant well, that I didn't want to seem difficult. Because women of my generation were taught that discomfort was preferable to confrontation, that silence was grace, and so I swallowed my objections, smiled politely, and let myself become background noise in my own life, until the day I couldn't ignore it anymore. The day the doctor spoke to my son. I had been admitted for tests after weeks of dizziness and fatigue. Nothing dramatic, nothing urgent. Just the slow accumulation of worry that comes with a body that has lived a long time. My son David insisted on coming with me, and I was grateful truly, but I did not expect him to replace me in conversations about my own body, my own future. And yet, when the doctor entered, he shook David's hand, glanced at me briefly, and then began explaining my condition to him, using words like she and her as if I were a chart instead of a person. And I remember looking at the doctor's lips moving, hearing my life summarized in medical terms, and feeling something inside me break. Not loudly, not dramatically, but deeply, because in that moment I realized that this wasn't just about health. It was about agency, about the terrifying ease with which society removes a woman's voice once she reaches a certain age. And I wanted to speak, I wanted to interrupt. To say I am right here, but years of conditioning held me still. Years of being praised for patience and compliance made my throat tighten instead of opening. And David, bless him, didn't notice at first, because he was focused, concerned, trying to be helpful, and I don't blame him. This is not a story about a bad son or a bad doctor. It is a story about a system that assumes age equals fragility and fragility equals silence. And as I lay there listening to decisions being discussed without my input, I felt the weight of all the other moments I had stayed quiet. All the times I let myself be overlooked because correcting it felt exhausting. And I wondered when exactly I had stopped insisting on being seen. Because it wasn't always this way. I remember being a young mother who spoke firmly at PTA meetings, a wife who managed household finances, a woman who held her husband's hand through chemotherapy and made the hardest decisions of their lives together. I had never been weak, never been incapable. And yet here I was, reduced to a passive presence in a conversation about my own future. And after the doctor left, the room felt unbearably quiet. Avid turned to me, concern etched on his face, and asked if I was okay, and something in me finally stirred. Not anger, not bitterness, but resolve. Because invisibility thrives on silence. And I was tired of feeding it. So I told him, gently but firmly, that I needed him to listen, that I appreciated his help, but that I was still capable of understanding my own body, making my own decisions, asking my own questions. And the look on his face, shock, guilt, sadness, told me that he hadn't realized what was happening, because invisibility is often invisible even to those closest to us. And to his credit, he apologized immediately, sincerely, and promised to do better. But the conversation didn't end there. Because once the door had opened, years of quiet feelings came pouring out. I told him about the small humiliations, the assumptions, the way people spoke over me, around me instead of to me, and as I spoke, I felt something return to me that I hadn't realized. I'd lost my voice. Not louder than before, not angrier, just steadier. And that night, lying alone in the hospital bed, I thought about how many women my age were experiencing the same quiet erasure. How many mothers and grandmothers were slowly being edited out of their own narratives. And I realized that dignity is not something given. It is something claimed, and claiming it requires courage. Especially when the world has grown accustomed to your silence. The next morning, when the doctor returned, I did something I hadn't done in years. I interrupted politely, calmly, and said, "Please speak to me." And to his credit, he paused, looked at me fully, and adjusted his tone, his posture, his focus. Then in that moment, something shifted, not just in the room, but in me, because I remembered who I was. Not a burden, not a fragile object, but a woman with a lifetime of experience, insight, and agency. And since then, I have made a quiet promise to myself to speak when spoken over, to ask questions when answers are directed elsewhere, to correct assumptions not with hostility, but with presence. And sitting here tonight at my kitchen table, the house quiet, the memories loud, I understand something now that I wish I had understood sooner. Aging does not make us less deserving of respect. It makes us more deserving, because every year lived adds depth, perspectives, and wisdom. And if there is one thing I want my story to leave behind, one truth I want to pass on, it is this: I am still here. I am still capable. I am still worthy of being addressed directly. And the day the doctor spoke to my son instead of me was not the day I disappeared. It was the day I remembered to insist on my place in the room, to reclaim my voice, and to remind the world and myself that even at 77, I am not invisible. I am present. I am listening, and I deserve to be heard.